So, as leaders and delegates from around the world meet in Paris in a bid to thrash out a hoped-for agreement aimed at limiting global temperature rises caused by greenhouse gas emissions, those from Africa find themselves in an unenviable position. The continent has contributed the least to the carbon emissions that have contributed to climate change, that yet stands to lose the most as it wreaks havoc with sea level, rainfall, and temperature. Meanwhile, Africa's push for development continues, and key to that is access to electricity across a continent where 600 million people do without. So, to discuss the challenges of avoiding a rising in carbon emissions whilst pushing access to energy, I'm joined by Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank. Thanks very much for joining us. Also, we have Carlos Lopez, the Executive Secretary for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And we're also joined by Maktar Diop, the World Bank's Vice President for Africa. Thank you very much for taking the time to come out and join us on the panel. And we've also got Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the Chair of the African Union Commission. Thank you very much, Madam, for joining us today. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start off not to be pessimistic, but the goal of limiting temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius, if everybody does what they say they're going to do with their climate pledges as they stand at the moment, it still doesn't look like that cap is going to be reached. From the African perspective, what do you think is the best case scenario of what you can get out of COP21 at the moment?
We've got to recognize that Africa is the least emitter in terms of greenhouse gas emissions right now. But we are suffering disproportionately because of that. So it seems to me that the critical things we first have to agree on is the polluter pays principle. In other words, those that are polluting have to make sure that they pay a greater price for Africa that is suffering the most. You go today to Ethiopia, you go to Mali, you go to Niger, you go everywhere, South Africa included, you have a lot of droughts, you have a lot more floods today, and livelihoods are terribly being affected. So I think what we would like to have from here is a binding agreement that actually binds those that are polluting the most to make sure that they keep their pollutions low. Secondly, is that today, we're really at about 1 degree Celsius, and Africa is burning. And so we've got to make sure that over the next, by 2020, we keep these to no more than, 1.5, because we're going to fry Africa completely.
Africa may have the moral high ground on this, but when, as you very clearly pointed out there, Africa has so much to lose, can it really afford to rely on the on that age-old argument of those who pollute the most should and have to do the most? What does it do in the meantime? What is the plan B, Carlos?
Well, I want to first make the point that we are where we are with all the consequences of climate change because of the last 50, 100 years. So it's an accumulation of problems, and that accumulation of problems is very much associated with the fact that it started when industrialization started in the world. So it's not something that we can just remedy by the temperature rise alone. Even if we stopped any temperature rising right now, it will take another 50 years for us to get to the pre-industrial temperatures. So we are really in a fix when it comes to Africa, wanting to industrialize, having all these challenges, and the scientists saying basically, look, not only we have climate injustice, but we also are challenging the possibility of others industrializing with the same pathway. So for us, the issue is going to be what pathway is the one that is allowed if we want not necessarily to make just justice, but if we want to be at the forefront of providing the solutions for the changing climate. And I think it is possible for Africa to position itself in that very specific niche that will allow Africa to lead rather than just be the passive recipient of some aid or some charity. Africa really has now suffered enough for it to be able to make the case that it has to be ahead of the game.
I mean, that is an interesting idea that Africa has something to offer. Madam Zuma, we were talking about that in the preparation before. But bearing in mind that Africa, that the whole point of the need to electrify Africa is because there is so much room and so much to be done in terms of industrializing the continent, and bearing in mind that it is seeing so many effects of climate change that it needs this, it's looking towards the world for financial help. How can Africa be seen as an opportunity to lead the world when it sounds like it's coming from so far behind?
Well, I think it's the opportunity for the world to work with Africa as it industrializes, so that it industrializes in a different way than the Industrial Revolution, so that we can industrialize in a cleaner way, using cleaner energy. So the world has to actually work with us to ensure that we have the technologies that will allow us, because we are not going to stop industrialization, we are not going to stop modernizing Africa, we are not going to stop development, but that we do it in a way that does not accelerate the climate change, that does not add a huge amount of greenhouse gases. So I think the question is, can the world afford not to do it with us? Because if it doesn't, it means we are saying we should go on as usual, get the temperatures out, get the greenhouses up. So I think the world has to just work with us so that we do industrialize, but in a way that is in line with the climate agenda of keeping the greenhouse gases low and also keeping the temperatures low. To do our own agriculture in a way that is climate smart, to really develop in a different trajectory than the one that has been followed before.
Is there really, if you put side by side Africa's right, because it does have a right to develop, and what Africa has at risk if climate change continues as it is, which is there one that's going to win out? Matcha.
Let's just reinforce some of the facts that my two brothers and Dr. Zuma just made. Africa is the fastest growing continent in the world. So the world demand will be driven in the future by what is happening in Africa. Should not forget that. Secondly, today for financing, the climate change could be an opportunity to give new opportunities for business to make money in Africa. This is not a charity. They will make money in investing in renewable energy in Africa. Hydro is a good proposition in investing in. Solar, you make money out of solar, you make money out of geothermal. So what you have a continent which is the fastest growing, the middle class is growing, the urbanization is there, the continent is starting to industrialize, and there is, at the same time, huge potential of hydro, huge potential of renewable energy. The US, Europe have exploited most of the hydroelectricity potential. We haven't exploited 6% of our potential of hydro. So what it is the money will not be the problem in the future. What we need to build is a transition to that so that people are confident to bring capital in investing in the sector. And that's what I would like to see out of this discussion of the COP21. So money which is going to adaptation being much more important than what is going right now in the discussion about financing climate change effect. You're talking about $100 billion going to climate change financing. What is the share of it going to adaptation? Because adaptation means investing in smart agriculture, investing in clean energy, and creating a path of clean growth, and for the private sector in all countries to make money. Let me just say a last word. We should not make the mistake of the past. This time we want also in Africa to be part of the technological revolution. And my brother Carlos here has been emphasizing it in many of our discussions that we had. Let's take the story of internet. Access to internet has been increasing in Africa. But what is the content which is coming from Africa in in internet. We should not have an increase of renewable energy and our the product produced outside Africa. We should make sure that how it's happened, such a technology is here, and we can start investing in those infrastructure and this technology in Africa and make the technological progress that we need in Africa to reach industrialization.
But let's talk about renewable energy. What does that mean? What are the options for people looking, watching the show? What are the main heads of the renewable energy possibilities for the continent that we're talking about? Carlos?
Well, one of the biggest projects right now is in Kenya with geothermal, 600 megabytes. That is huge. You know, it represents about half of Kenya's consumption. And Kenya has a potential for geothermal that is much higher than what they have already explored. This is just one avenue among so many. The entire continent of Europe, if it was importing energy from solar in Africa, produced in Africa, it will be about 3% of our potential, which is nothing. So the potential for renewable energies in Africa, and Maktar just mentioned the hydro, 6% explored so far, is incredible. So we don't need to actually put in competition whether we are going to industrialize with fossil fuel production or with renewables. Renewables for us is not just one option, it's the best option. So we are
in the meantime, what happens to those sectors that rely on fossil fuel at the moment? They're not going to disappear. It's not as if whether there's more investment from the banks or whether there is more money coming from developed nations that it's going to pop on the table and the existing reliance on fossil fuel disappears. What's the transition period we're looking at here?
Correct, but let me just say that when it comes to fossil fuels, Africans actually spend about $15 billion a year with subsidies. They are subsidizing it instead of putting the money in the alternative. And that subsidies structure is basically undermining the possibility of further development because that money should go into investment. But you know, the specialist on investment is Hakim next to me. But I think it's very important because he made energy really his number one priority and we are all very excited with it. But I think it is very important for us to realize that the discussion of an alternative between developing and affecting the environment is no longer there. We can develop and we can sustain the environment. We have to do it the right way.
Akumi, I saw you very eager to jump in on that one, so we'll let you have your say.
No, the reason is that where Africa is starting from today is an awful position. You've got 600 million people, actually 640 million people that don't have access to electricity in Africa. You've got 700 million people that cannot even have access to clean cooking energy, basically things we take for granted for cooking, right? Most of those are women. We lose 600,000 of them every year just from the smoke of relying on kerosene, on charcoal and firewood.
And the African Development Bank's actually started an initiative to focus that
but that's
specifically.
what Carlos was saying. That is why we said, for Africa, we have to light up and power Africa. To get the kind of industrialization that we're talking about, we cannot industrialize with potential. Now, he was talking about geothermal in Kenya. Just look at the whole figures, actually. All the sunshine we've got in Africa can give us 11 terawatts of electricity. All the hydro that we have can give us 350 gigawatts of electricity. The geothermal that my brother talked about, we have 15 gigawatts potential, and wind, another 150 gigawatts of it. So what all of that is potential, potential, potential. We've got to unlock that. In fact, the three of us, we were just here where we launched what is called the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, which is supposed to provide 300 gigawatts of electricity by 2030. I think we can do it much faster. But here are the issues as far as I'm concerned. I believe that Africa can use all of the renewables it has, and we have to. But we've got to also power our industries. You know, how many countries in the world do you see that power industries from solar? No. You can light up with solar. But you've got to also look at the base load power you need to power industries. To do that, here are the costs. If you take coal, right? Everybody's kind of bad-mouthing coal. You have coal, you have literally hydro, and you also have gas. These are the three fuel sources that allows you to be able to industrialize. They are new technologies. Look, Africa cannot be in a situation where others have been able to industrialize and be at the top, right? And then when they get there, the ladder that gets them there, they kick it out of the way and say, look, you can't do that. No, I really believe what's crucial is that Africa needs to have energy, period. Look at the energy mix, and then have a timeline in which we actually make sure that we are transitioning what we're saying into a lot more of our mix coming from renewable versus non-renewable. But we've
I'm
got
just
so
going to stop you
much.
there. I'm just going to stop you there because I'd really like to ask Madam Zuma, within the context of the COP21, we know we've heard great arguments as to the comprehensive potential and plans to electrify Africa. If it just gets a bit of help, it kind of gets the ball rolling. But despite the rhetoric, despite the stated support for these projects and Africa's role in reducing carbon emissions and finding new ways of energizing the continent, is the need to develop Africa really a priority for the more developed countries also at the table at COP21?
Well, first of all, it is our priority, and we are going to do it.
But within the context
Secondly,
of this conference, do you think they care, really?
I think so. I think they care. We all live in the same planet. They will be affected also at some stage. So I think they do care. But I think it's not so much dependent on them, because developing Africa is our responsibility. We have to do it. Mokta has just said they can invest and make money out of our development. And it's true that it's not that today we are going to close all the fossil fuel, the coal power stations. But what we are saying is we are going to increasingly increase the clean energy so that we have a good mix. And of course, there are also technologies that are being developed. Yesterday, I think it was Russia that was talking about a nanotechnology that can absorb carbon, so that it means if that becomes a reality, you can actually use coal without putting carbon into the atmosphere. So there are lots of things that are happening, and I think they care because they know they are the biggest polluters. They know what we are suffering comes from that, but they also know that we are in the same planet. So their grandchildren will also inherit this planet, which is becoming damaged unless we do something today.
Thank you very much, Madam Zuma. Thank you very much for the panel, but I'm going to have to stop everyone there because we're going to take a quick break. We'll pick up where we left off after this short pause.